I'm going to take your body, and I'm going to walk it out of here. And you get to watch me do it, completely helpless, just like you left me.
Your vision fades as she tears open the membrane of your soul.
Slay the Princess is a pretty polarizing game, something which I've found has been reflected in the forums, but not for the reasons you might think. You don't need to look much further than the trailer to see a slew of massive ratings, 10 out of 10 back to back, and I have no doubt that these reviewers meant exactly what they said. It's a mysteriously and staggeringly expansive tale that uses a time loop model of dying and restarting again and again to present you with an ever-changing world without ever really making it clear what your true goal is in order to complete the game in the traditional sense. Its ability to react and respond to your choices in either obvious or subtle ways sometimes made me just stop playing for a moment and grin in awe of the back-end design. Slaying the Princess may be your first major objective on paper, or indeed the most obvious one for you to carry out, or not, depending on your feelings, but from the moment you start on a path in the forest, every single choice you make does take you down some kind of a distinct path, whether you realize it or not. All you know is that there are no wrong decisions, and dying is never the end. Its methods of keeping you on your toes seem to be endless. For instance, one time, fairly early into the game, I was faced with a being of considerable power. I was growing tired, figuratively speaking, of the lies that appeared to be coming from every direction, and decided now was the time to show my defiance and push back against the advice I was being given. I refused to continue and challenged the being to wait an eternity with me. I just wanted to see what would happen. The entity told me that I would get bored.
Because you'll always want to know what it means to be you.
That I would be back, and that it would be waiting for me.
I will be here waiting by your side until you're ready to return to mine.
And then this happened. Yep, I had to boot the game back up.
You have returned to me. Though you were gone mere moments, I never left your side.
And I thought it was awesome. I can't say that I see it happening that often in gaming, and I have few memories of developers reaching through the fourth wall and poking me in the eye since the days of Metal Gear Solid. It does take some careful coding too, and was an early clue as to the extent the writers would go to try and twist and weave the story beyond my expectations. And for the most part, it did, and I loved it for that. If you're enjoying this, then please don't forget to like or better yet subscribe, as that is literally the currency that allows YouTube to pay me. A little click from you is a massive win for me. Thank you so much. Alright, plug over, back to the video. Google how long it takes to complete and you'll see things like 3 hours or 5 hours and so on. But look a little further and you'll uncover the real truth, which is that to experience all the endings, if you could even find them all, would take days and days. But do you want to spend that much time gazing at the simplistic, hand-drawn world and listening to the lengthy expositions as the same two actors throw their voices in a myriad of different ways in order to uncover its wealth of endings?
She's disappointed in us?
Neil.
Well, that is the real question. In order to fully appreciate its depth and full potential, you have to invest quite a few more hours into it than you might first appreciate. Depending on your standards, especially considering what's on the market these days, it's unlikely that you'll be blown away by the voice acting, or graphics, or the early story. They're original and lovingly produced for sure, but it's the unorthodox progression of the narrative that really gets you, that raises this up to something worthy of winning awards, which it did. However, once I felt I'd reached a certain stage and had a pretty solid grasp of the larger story, I found that there was still so many more roots and realities to uncover, and at some point I realized that I was just playing to ensure that I wasn't missing out on a larger, more significant ending that would provide a twist and upturn what I already knew. During this time, I just felt a certain degree of monotony crept into the gameplay cycle, and all the twists and turns of the story couldn't mitigate that, because there's only so much time that I personally can spend absorbed in an animated picture book.
You're on a path in the woods.
It was bittersweet because I really didn't want to stop playing. I couldn't stop playing. The draw to come back and experience the next evolution of the narrative was indicative of the brilliance of the writing, which I personally felt was deserving of a higher budget, as controversial as that might sound. The animation's riveting when it occurs, and the jarring movements of the princess sometimes work in her favour because that unsettling staccato movement can be horrifying in itself in the right context. The simple abstract graphics actually serve to make the world more abstract, which is partially the point. It enables gore and violence to be depicted without ever straying too far from its somewhat wholesome approach to horror. It's dark and sometimes pretty frightening for sure, but it never really strays into something that would give a kid nightmares, for instance. And I did love this for much of my playthrough, but before I reached the conclusion, I personally found, and this is just me, but I personally found it had started to wear just a little thin. The further I pushed, the more immersed in the story I became, because the more inventive it gets, and the more you understand the underlying patterns which cause your choices to directly manifest in the following chapters. But the more I played, the less invested in the overall experience I would be, because I was finding myself less and less charmed by the simple drawings, and yearning for more clever, fourth wall breaking humour that never reared its head again.
Is she talking about you? That's impossible. She's not supposed to be able to interact with me.
You're a small one, aren't you?
The internal dialogues are witty, Jonathan Sims' many voices are amazing, and their relevance to your progression are actually more relevant than you might realise, but they weren't enough to keep me entertained past a point.
She's a prisoner. Shit. In a sudden burst of movement, the princess leaps towards you, a blade erupting from her free arm.
Eventually, I started to rely on the spacebar to skip dialogue because I wanted to accelerate the experience and get to the next juicy plot development, and at that point I realised that the game's hooks were losing their grip. Of the various time loop games on the market that use different methods to alleviate this issue, the Stanley Parable is perhaps the best direct comparison.
When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left. This was not the correct way to the meeting room.
It was also a quasi-horror indie title, and also developed by a small team, just one in the case of Stanley Parable, whereas the couple Abby and Tony Howard developed Slay the Princess together, but simple 3D Unity graphics being used instead of thought-provoking hand-drawn images.
Stanley walked through the red door.
But where the Stanley Parable was short and sweet and provided a more distilled experience,
Stanley walked through the red door.
Slay the Princess blindsides you with such a staggering wealth of choices and conclusions that the conclusion I drew was that you don't really play to finish it per se, unless you're a hardcore completionist. You play it until you're content that you've seen enough and understood enough, but without a definitive singular end. I just felt that I'd never really seen enough, and it just left me a little bit dispirited.
I'm going to kill you now.
With a squelch, she does just that.
The game's true genius is in the fact that, visual novel or not, few gaming experiences can boast such a different experience for each player. No 2 players will walk the same path, because right from the very first seconds you are offered choices. Do I walk to the cabin or do I turn back? It took me a few deaths before the latter even occurred to me, and when I finally decided to give up on my mission entirely, my resistance was met with a chilling reality. If I tried a gentle hand, I was rewarded in kind. If I got frustrated and went for the kill, the game took a dark and sometimes frightening turn. I found out who I was, I found out who was talking to me, I found out everything, and yet when I pushed on, I found out that I knew less than I thought. I am confident that there is still a lot more to know, but at this stage, for me, I realised I'm just not invested anymore. I reached a point where I fell in love with the game, and then I sailed past it and realised I'd played for too long. The finales, which can be reached more than once under different scenarios, not quite as profound as some of the ratings might have you believe. It's somewhat pseudo-philosophical and hints at a larger, richer world beyond what you ever get to see, and instead focuses on an uncharacteristically human romance between omnipotent beings. It was a little reminiscent of folk tales or comic books, where it's more about the message than the practicalities of realism. But in reaching that conclusion, the intricate path that you take is crafted ahead of you one step at a time, confirming that this is a story far more about the journey than the destination. Slay the Princess is not a game for everyone, because no matter how well conceived or beautifully produced it may be, it's still just an animated picture book that requires a certain degree of dedication from the uninitiated to reach the core expositions. In fact, if I hadn't been intending to review it, I probably would have given up. But if I had done that, I would have missed out on the mesmerizing epic that grew so much beyond its humble beginnings into something that really did leave me flabbergasted at times.
The princess's skin twists, splitting into red blooms of raw meat as it stretches and tears. Then it erupts.
So all I'll say is this: beware of the scale of what you're getting yourself into. Put plenty of time aside, consider whether you enjoy visual novels enough to see it through, but don't in any way feel guilty for stopping playing at any point, because if you leave enough in the tank to be able to fuel another session, this odyssey of discovery is absolutely the type of game that, if you let it, will always leave you wanting to come back for more. Thank you so much for watching, take care of yourself, and see you next time.